Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you my first look at the healer trinkets for the Season 2 Aberrus raid, the other half of Dragonflight M+, and beyond. In this video, I'm going to talk about the trinkets as they stand at the moment, where I think they're going to get tuned, different possible combinations that'll be good to farm, why you would farm them, as well as which damage trinkets I think are performing the best at the moment, if you want to be able to acquire those as well. Very important thing to note is, just like Vault of the Incarnates, there's some very rare trinkets in here. So some of them, like the Whispering Incarnate icon in Season 1, were just far and away our best in slot, but they were a pain in the ass to be able to acquire because everybody wanted them and they were very rare. Aberrus continues this trend with two very rare trinkets right off the bat, one of which is the Seething Black Dragon Scale, which is into agi strength, so everybody's going to want it. And it also is increasing your crit strike and leech at the same time. This is exactly like the trinket that we had from Nyalotha, except it gave haste back in the day, I believe. So it gave haste and speed from Rathian, whereas this one in Aberrus is actually giving you int and crit with leech. So the uptime was super high when I was using this for testing, and it is far away going to be one of your better healing trinkets. As long as you like crit as a healer, you're going to love this trinket, and the extra leech uptime is really noticeable. It's really nice. About 300 leech, I believe, is coming to around 3%, as you can see on the right side of your screen there. I have 5% base leech from my talents, and then about 3% or so from different items on my gear that are providing it. So having almost perma 3% leech is going to be really, really good for a lot of healers in Raid, or everybody in Raid, making it one of the biggest standout trinkets. Echo of Neltharion also has a very rare trinket. They're also dependent on your class. So Rogue, Priest, Death Knight, Druid have one, Hunter, Shaman, Warlock have another, and I'm not sure why it doesn't show it on this, but all the rest have another one as well. They're giving you different bonuses and all that other fun stuff. I believe the one that's missing is like your AoE spells will increase your intellect. And I believe it gives mastery. So the healer one for Priest is giving you versatility baseline, and then your harmful debuffs, spells, and abilities have a chance to grant you intellect. So for Holy Priest, you actually have to be actively DPSing to proc this, which isn't the end of the world, mind you, but I really didn't see very high uptime throughout the testing, and I really expect that this is going to get changed so that you're going to be able to have a mess of value from it. But having versatility proccing intellect is quite awkward when playing Disc because you're just in a very ramp-centric type of setup, and so when you're not having the uptime, you're missing out on a massive amount of strength for your ramp potential. Because keep in mind, as we're looking at some of these 415 items, they're giving you 500 intellect baseline. You're getting 6 or 7 times that in a proc effect. So if you have it in a disc ramp, you're winning big, but if you don't, obviously you're not. For other healers that have a more consistent healing profile, yeah, I expect that these trinkets are going to be incredibly good. The Shaman and Monk one is going to be baseline haste, so great for monks, kind of meh for Shaman. Your summons attacks have a chance to grant you intellect for 12 seconds. So on the side of Monk, that would be like GG. I don't even know if Yu'lon even attacks on its own. And Shaman would be like your elementals, I guess, which might make it extremely hard to be able to proc this. So I haven't seen what Shamans have been doing or Monks have been doing with this trinket, but adding on to the fact that it's very rare, this might be an incredibly difficult trinket to actually acquire, much less be able to properly utilize. Moving on into some of the other healing trinkets as we wanted to keep on going through. Like I mentioned, there's a whole category dedicated to those that are very rare. There's one, which I'm very interested in, called the Ward of Faceless Ire. It's all stats, by the way, int, agi, and strength, which means that a tank could possibly wear this as well. It originally was a 3-minute cooldown, and they've now nerfed it down to a 2. And it grants an ally this ward, absorbing 260k damage. For reference, we're in almost this Vault of the Incarnates gear, and we have like about 330k health. So this is a little bit more than a DPS or healer player's max health, which is also a little bit strange. 2-minute cooldown, and then if the shield breaks, not partially consumed, but if it breaks, then it's going to deal a little bit of shadow damage, like 33k shadow damage over 6 seconds to the last enemy that strikes it. This is very similar to a trinket we had back in Legion from the Antorus raid. It was the Antoran High Command fight. And let me tell you, this thing was way better than the Ward of Faceless Ire. It was a considerably easier spell to work with because it was a larger shield, if I remember correctly, or an equivalent one, but it was only a 1-minute cooldown. And so it was a very reliable shielding effect to work with. It was not a high HPS trinket. It was not a trinket that people used back in Legion to do all the healing they could, but it was absolutely vital for Mythic Plus, to the point that in some really high key groups, multiple players like Hunters would be using this Fel Shield emitter to survive incoming damage. So to see this back in the Aberrus raid, being on a 2-minute cooldown and doing very little damage is quite disappointing. I know that they had it at 3 minutes before, it's now 2 minutes. I would really love for this trinket to be a 1 or even 1.5 minute effect, because I'm not really expecting a lot out of it. I know it's because it has intellect baseline on it, but I think taking more of the strength and making it focused on just massive shields that you can situationally use it in a dungeon environment as you like is wonderful. And I hope that they kind of mess around with that a bit more, because having the intellect to try to bring up the HPS side of it, I was just not a fan. I want a situational trinket that I can kind of switch on and off. There are a number of damage trinkets, and we'll go over those in a sec, but I also want to make sure I'm focusing on healer trinkets. So this is another interesting one. This comes from the Forgotten Experiments encounter, and it's not very rare, surprisingly enough. And so there's a whole bunch of words, but basically you resonate with the power of your Dragonflight, granting secondary stats. And if allies are sworn to a different Dragonflight, you gain secondary stats from your resonance. And you can only benefit from 1 resonance per flight. So what you ideally want to have is a party of 5 people, or actually it would be any allies, excuse me. You ideally want to make sure that the people that are receiving this trinket first are all liking different secondary stats. And then there's a resonance effect where you need to attune to a Dragonflight O Stone. And these are the O Stones that you see right here on screen. This is in the Ruby Life Pools. These are just same thing as we saw on the quest line, that you want to make sure you attune to these different things. And it's also just like Algathar Academy. So you kind of just kneel down and you get empowered with the Dragonflight, and then you get a buff, which gives you versatility. Same thing as we saw, if I remember correctly, out of Algathar. The Bronze Dragonflight will give you haste. The Red Dragonflight gives you versatility. I believe the Black Dragonflight kind of gives you Omni stats. It gives you like a little bit of everything. I want to say the Blue Dragonflight gives mastery, and then the green gives crit. But you have to go out into the world to attune to this O Stone to be able to properly utilize, making it a very powerful trinket. But I also noticed in testing that if I switch trinkets, I would have to like go back to the resonance and take it over. So I'm not sure if that's going to go in live, but that was very annoying to deal with. From the raid healing trinket perspectives, I think you're really going to be focused on this resonance trinket no matter what. So if you're a part-time raider or something like that, going into the Forgotten Experiments fight is going to be absolutely vital, so you can get a decent stat trinket that you can consistently use no matter what. There's a few other healing trinkets that I also wanted to highlight in this. These are also going to be from dungeons. So the Spoils of Neltharion, as it says, is from Neltharion. This one is going to rotate between your secondary stats, and it's a 2-minute on use, granting a fat amount of stats, 3,000 in secondary stats. For example, I have about 4,000 in haste, and I'm hard stacking it as a Disc Priest. This is going to give you 50-60% upgrade into your secondary stat of choice. But the problem is, it'll continually cycle through, and so you're going to need a weak aura to be able to track which buff. This could be alright for Disc, since in the worst case scenario, I mean, if you get a haste benefit, you could use it as a PI, but if you get it in like a crit or mastery or even versatility, you could use it with your evangelism, and then you'd be able to utilize it in that way to be able to just ramp up the damage and ramp up the power of your ramp effect. Problem is, it's a 2-minute cooldown, which doesn't really align with the 1.5-minute cooldown we'd like to see for a lot of Disc stuff. For other healers, yeah, you could just roll with a very powerful on-use effect for more healing. The time-breaching Talon is really good for a bunch of ramp and bursty effects. I don't know how good this would be for something like Druid, but it's also a 2.5 minute cooldown where you gain 2,500 intellect for 20 seconds and then lose 800 intellect for the 20 seconds, I believe, that follows. So you have really high power and then, again, the drawback. Nice thing is that it's haste, but the other side is it's a 2.5 minute cooldown, making it extremely awkward, once again, to be able to utilize. There's a third of these on-use effects. This is the Iridius fragment that you're getting from, I want to say is Halls of Infusion. Mastery, on-use, 3-minute cooldown, gaining intellect, and then reduced by every time you use an ability. So there's like these 3 trinkets, 2 minutes, 2.5, and 3 minutes, that you could potentially be utilizing as a Disc Priest to be able to put together a ramp of sorts. The problem is, all their cooldowns are weird. There's a 4th trinket that's also intellect granting stats, which is the Erupting Spear fragment. I believe it's also from Neltharion, where you throw a spear and then it kind of comes back, gives you crit. This is like the Theater of Pain trinket. I'm trying to remember. It's like the Soul-Letting Ruby, I want to say, where you're able to like throw down the effect and it comes back to you. The problem is, it's not something where you just on use and hit your target. It's actually a radius effect. So you need to be able to drop something to hit your trinket, and thankfully it's not on the GCD, and thankfully the spear comes back to you really quickly, so there's not much travel time. But this trinket might be something where you need to have macroed into a cursor effect, so you can like mouse over an area, hit your button, it throws, comes back to you, you're getting your buff, and then you're going. The other downside is this is only 10 seconds of crit strike, and you get more crit depending on how many enemies you hit. So even though this is a 1.5 minute cooldown, for a Disc Priest Evangelism, it has the downside of, again, needing to aim this cursor effect, needing to hit multiple enemies, and then you have only 10 seconds to be able to get value out of it. So there's a lot of downsides when it comes to the trinkets that are available to you going into progression for this raid as Disc Priest. For other healers, you just kind of have a wealth of like secondary stats to be able to properly work with. Another really important trinket that we have right here is called Rashok's Molten Heart. This is another raid trinket that we have, and as you might have guessed, it's from Rashok the Elder. Your healing spells, and again this is baseline intellect, have a chance to awaken the heart, gaining radiance for 10 seconds. While active, you gain 10k mana, and your healing spells heal for an additional 2,300. Overhealing from the effect invigorates your target, granting up to 553 versatility. Now, this trinket is actually really fascinating because it is obscenely broken. Throughout our Magmarax kill the other day, I received, just like double my mana bar in a 5-minute fight on Magmarax, which was way more than I think it ever intended. It also ended up doing 3% of my overall healing on top of that. So it was just non-stop mana regen that I was having all the time and doing a decent amount of healing. And it's baseline intellect. So this was like by far the most powerful trinket that we had to be able to have access to in testing. But a lot of that, again, is because the mana regained was just absurd. So keep that in mind. I do think this is definitely a trinket to watch for, especially from a healer perspective, for those who can chew through mana very effectively. Kind of like Mistweaver as well. You're able to turn more mana into more output on a dime. Can be great, but we have to actually see what the end tuning of this is going to be, because as fun as it is, I really don't think that having just a casual 500,000 in mana regen or anything like that is really intended. Unfortunately on that one. I believe the last healing-oriented trinket that I had to highlight is the Water's Beating Heart. This one drops out of Halls of Infusion as well, and it was terrible in Mythic Zeros. Intellect on use, 2-minute cooldown, increase an ally's armor, and then heals them for 85k. Once again, we have about 300,000 health going into this new raid, going into this new season. And this is a 421, so this is like a normal raid quality item, if I remember correctly. I believe that's around. Oh, it's actually a little bit higher than a normal raid quality. So yeah, very low healing effect, increases armor, and the effects are increased based on the current health of the target and are more powerful on targets below 20%. So you need to be able to snipe this on your tank when they're low to increase their armor and give them some damage reduction. No. Just not a good trinket that you need to worry about at all. Might be a little bit better for you to go into DPS spec when you're in the Halls of Infusion, because you just don't want to deal with that at all. Now, of course, I know healers not only want to be able to find out what's going to do lots of healing for them, but also great damage. There's a few different trinkets that I was testing throughout, and some of them are coming from the raid, and some of them are also coming from Mythic Plus. So, for this, let me go back to the Shadow setup. There's a few really high damage options that Priest and all healers really have at their disposal. This one is from the very last boss of the raid. It is a 2.5 minute cooldown. It was a 3-minute cooldown, but they nerfed a bit of the damage that it deals, and then they nerfed a bit of the cooldown, or reduced a bit of the cooldown. But it's Mastery, and it's a 2.5 minute cooldown where you just drop a nuke. You just drop the stars on your enemies and deal 400,000 damage split between all nearby enemies, and the damage is increased for every enemy struck. This was far and away the highest damage trinket that I had tested. Was obscene in the amount of damage that it actually ended up providing. Problem is, it's from the last boss of the raid. So, for some people, this could actually just take more time to properly acquire. Wonderful, wonderful damage option that you had at your disposal, but it's really, as a healer, an all-in trinket. A lot of healers do not like their Mastery when they go and run into 5-mans, because it's not increasing their damage, it's not really increasing their survivability, and for some healers, Mastery is just not that good for their healing either. So it's a really all-in trinket to just do lots of damage. And with, Master Looter being what it is, it might be very hard to acquire this one. But keep it in mind, if you get fortunate in the vault, it could be extremely high damage if the tuning stays where it is at. Another wonderful, wonderful damage option I found, which also did a ton, is from Magmarax, which is the Flowstone, the Igneous Flowstone. So you alternate between high tide and low tide every 45 seconds. At low tide, your next range ability gives you crit strike, and it's a lot too. It's 4,000 crit. Again, that's almost double what I would have so far, so it would be something along the lines of like 20 or 30% crit strike that you would gain. Very good. And at high tide, you send a lava wave, which crashes and splits between all enemies that you hit. This was also extremely high damage when I was testing it, a bit less than the Beacon to the Beyond when I was doing dungeons. Also just a really good ability, and it's int baseline, which means that you're not quite as all-inny on just doing lots of damage. It's a good way to be able to mix in damage and still have high intellect to be able to buff your healing when you need it, when you're learning these dungeons, and you're gaining crit strike for damage or healing, although the uptime of that low tide was, again, fairly low because you're getting it every 90 seconds for 12 seconds or something along those lines, so the uptime is not super high. But it's very much like a hybrid trinket to sort of think about in that regard. The Brackenhide Hollow trinket, the Idol of Pure Decay, where it's just your damaging abilities have a chance to launch a volley of decay. It slows enemies by like 30%, which is not that much, but it deals a decent amount of damage, and this is a pretty strong, it's kind of like the equivalent of like your Feather, I would say, going into it, but it's also really important to be hitting it onto AoE enemies. Thankfully, from the dungeons we've seen so far, we've been able to test the first 7. Most of them have a good mix of single target and AoE, but we don't quite know what Vortex Pinnacle is going to be like. Some of the AoE-oriented trinkets, for example, are not that effective in things like Court of Stars, where most of the pulls are like 3 to 5 mobs tops. You're not really having the mass AoE that you would have out of something like Algathar Academy, and so those are kind of important to think about whenever you're going through that gearing process. The last trinket that I had onto the books is the Smoldering Lava Puffer, where you take a little adventurous nibble, giving you heartburn, granting your spells and range attacks a chance to cause you to belch spittle towards your target, dealing volcanic damage. But it also makes a pool where you'd want your tank to start sitting in it. I had pretty bad results with this as a damage trinket throughout our testing, and wouldn't really recommend it at the moment. It seemed like either it was bugged or just terribly tuned at present, but that was just kind of my experience so far. I think the kind of easiest and like most default trinkets that I would really recommend people target early on is absolutely every single week doing the Forgotten Experiments to try to get this Resonance trinket. The fact that it's not very rare is extremely surprising, and it's just int with good stats, and you can customize and augment the stats however you like. So that one is going to be easy to acquire and important to acquire. absolutely killing Kazara every single week to try to get the Seething Black Dragon Scale, but keeping in mind that it's going to be very tough to get. If you get this in your vault, I would absolutely just slam dunk it all the time, no matter what, because you just never know when it's going to be your turn to actually loot this item. Something to keep in mind. When it comes to disc ramps and everything, I'm kind of leaning towards the Iridius Fragment, but I think that's also going to be a little bit more fight dependent. If you can get into encounters where you can have reliable 2-minute ramps, wonderful, but it always feels bad having to delay your evangelism on the side of a trinket. I think with something like Iridius, you could easily put together one strong ramp, one weaker ramp, and just not have a trinket for some of the ramps that you have on hand, and adjusting some of your raid cooldowns as a result to sort of compensate. But overall, I feel like we're kind of missing like a super solid dungeon trinket or two, and I'm hoping Vortex Pinnacle fills in the gaps of that, because all we can really extrapolate from that dungeon at the moment is that there's no trinkets at present. So a lot of times these time walking, these old dungeons do follow the same loot tables. We saw that much to be true when it came to like Court of Stars, Nel's Lair, Underrot. They have a couple of like damage trinkets, and again, we'll have to see how strong those are going to be, because things like Eye of Skovald turned out to be immensely powerful when Halls of Valor got brought back for Season 1, but some other trinkets can also fall by the wayside, so those are always things to keep in mind. For now, it feels like there's way heavy amounts of damage options for healers, and very difficult to acquire healing trinkets, if not trinkets that will just get passed to DPS players very quickly. So this healer trinket meta is gravely concerning, because there's not a lot that'll just be for us. There's a lot of items that would get traded to DPS players in a heartbeat, making it substantially harder for us to acquire trinkets going into the next raid. So it very well could be that Alchemist Stone and maybe like the Idol trinket, which gives you secondaries based off of your gems that you have socketed, could be extremely powerful for us to bring into the next raid, so that we at least have something. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it, found it useful. Be sure to subscribe for more, and let me know what other kind of Season 2 updates you're looking forward to. Thanks, guys.